In seventh grade, I read Lord of the Flies, William Golding's 1954 Nobel Prize-winning book. The story is familiar to many of you. British schoolboys, a plane crash, alone on an island during the war, elect a leader, try to follow the rules. The whole thing falls to pieces. Boys gang up on others. Tribes are created. Someone dies. They finally are rescued by a British naval officer who says those famous lines, looking at a paint-streaked, ravaged band of boys. He says, "I should have thought that a pack of British boys would have put on a better show than that." The story suggests that despite our best efforts to uphold order and civility, humans are inherently prone to self-destruction. That despite what we want to believe or hope for, the line between civilized order and the inherent human savagery is blurred and just under the surface. Watching news reports of Boogaloo boys, grown men in Hawaiian shirts and flak jackets with Trump 2020 flags attacking peaceful Black Lives Matter protests would make you believe that we are seeing just this. This lesson and the story of Lord of the Flies is so ingrained in our culture, in our minds, that any group acts of chaos or violence are quickly associated with the Lord of the Flies. And while I would always remain on the side of our inherent goodness, believing we are capable of great violence, there is no underestimating how damaging stories we tell ourselves about our evil natures are in our souls. I'm not sure Golding intended to cause us to associate the human spirit with savagery, but he did in an interview say his intent was, quote, "to expose the beast within every one of us and tell a realistic story, a book," as he put it, about real boys on an island showing what a mess they'd make. That seems pretty clear. I don't know what Golding experienced in his life to lead him to those conclusions, and I don't know what an awful mess he witnessed. And I'm not condemning or protesting against his fine book. The point is that stories are powerful, and maybe more powerful than we know. They shape and change our behavior. They shape and change our heart. They change who we are from the first things we learn from those who raise us, the stories they tell us, and they work on us for better or for ill. Take someone who hears the story of Cain and Abel over and over in church as a child. She might come to the same conclusion as Golding did, that life is violence and inner decay. And when we aren't at our best behavior, we are capable of terrible things. But what about someone who heard a different story about cooperation and love among siblings in the face of a challenge? They might conclude something different about human nature. The stories we are telling ourselves about this moment in history, about our place in the natural world, our ability to overcome exceptionalism and racism, or how we might treat each other as ends to means, or the capacity to survive and thrive, all change our future. These stories that we are telling or are allowing to be told are changing us and changing our future. One thing that informs the future is the story of the past, our lives, of what we have and can imagine. You each are a culmination of so many stories. Some painful stories of neglect or loss. Some wonderful stories of joy and healing and hope. And the only thing we can do is shape and guide who we want to be. And it matters what we tell ourselves about our past and what we tell ourselves about the future. So here's the real story of the Lord of the Flies. I want to share with you something I found. Historian Rutger Bregman did some research, wondering, as I have, if a pack of boys ever did get marooned on an island, what would be different? And he found this. In 1965, a group of Tongan boys, 6 boys, Sion, Stephen, Kolo, David, Luke, and Mano, all pupils at a strict Catholic boarding school in Nuku'alofa. The oldest was 16, the youngest 13, and they had one thing in common. They were bored to tears. So they came up with a plan to escape. To Fiji, they said, some 500 miles away, or even to New Zealand. There was only one obstacle. None of them owned a boat. So they decided to borrow one from Mr. Uhila, a fisherman they all disliked in the town. The boys took a little time to prepare for the voyage. They brought 2 sacks of bananas, a few coconuts, and small gas burner. It didn't occur to any of them to bring a map, let alone a compass. No one in the town noticed when the small craft left the harbor that evening. Skies were fair, only a mild breeze ruffled the calm sea, but that night the boys made a grave error. They all fell asleep. And a few hours later they awoke to water crashing down over their heads. It was dark, and they hoisted the sail, which the wind promptly tore to shreds. Next to break was the rudder. They said, "We drifted for 8 days, without food, without water." The boys tried catching fish. They managed to collect some rainwater in a hollowed-out coconut shell. They shared it equally between them, each taking a sip in the morning and another in the evening. Then on the 8th day, they spied a miracle on the horizon, a small island to be precise. Not a tropical paradise with waving palm trees and sandy beaches, but a hulking mass of rock jutting up more than 1,000 feet out of the ocean. These days, Ata is considered uninhabitable. The island Ata had been inhabited once until a day in 1863 when a slave ship appeared on the horizon and sailed off with all the natives. Since then, Ata had been deserted, cursed, and forgotten. The boys set up a commune with food gardens. They hollowed out tree trunks to store rainwater. They set up a gymnasium with weights they created out of the things they found on the island. They set up a badminton court. They penned chickens that they found roaming around the island. And from all their handiwork, an old knife blade was the only tool they had. They tended a fire so that it never went out for more than a year. The kids agreed to work in teams of 2, drawing up a strict roster for garden, kitchen, and guard duty. Sometimes they quarreled, but whenever that happened, they solved it by imposing timeouts. Their days began and ended with song and prayer. Kolo fashioned a makeshift guitar from a piece of driftwood, half coconut shell, and steel wires salvaged from their wrecked boat, an instrument that Peter kept all these years. All their spirits needed uplifting from time to time. Music, song, and prayer were what held them together. All summer, that summer, it rained hard, driving the boys into frantic notions. They tried to construct a raft to leave the island, but it fell apart, crashing in the surf. The worst thing that happened was Stephen slipped one day and fell off a cliff and broke his leg. The other boys picked their way down after them and helped him back to the top. They set his leg using sticks and leaves. "Don't worry," Sion joked. "We'll do your work while you lie there like the king himself." They survived initially on fish and coconuts and the birds they tamed, and seabird eggs they sucked dry. Later, when they got to the top of the island, in the volcanic crater, they found the chickens and the bananas and the taro that had been producing themselves for hundreds of years from the Tongans who had lived there before. Then one day, an Australian sea captain, Peter Warner, took a little detour on his way home and went past the island Ata. Peter noticed something odd. Looking through his binoculars, he saw patches of green cliff burned. In the tropics, he said, it was unusual for fires to start spontaneously. And then he saw a boy, hair down to his shoulders, who leapt from the cliffs and plunged into the water, and suddenly more boys followed, screaming at the tops of their lungs. The boys swam to the boat. "My name is Stephen," he cried in perfect English. "There are 6 of us. We reckon we've been here 15 months. The boys, once aboard, claimed they were students at a boarding school in the capital. So using his two-way radio, the captain called the capital and he said, "I have 6 kids here. Stand by," he said. 20 minutes later, they called the captain. They said, "You found them? These boys have been given up for dead. Funerals have been held. It's them? It's a miracle," they reported. The boys were rescued on Sunday, September 11th, 1966. The local physician later examined them, astonished at their muscular physiques and Stephen's perfectly healed leg. Then the police boarded Peter's boat and arrested the boys and threw them into jail. It turned out that Mr. Uhila, whose sailing boat the boys had borrowed 15 months earlier, was still pissed, and he decided to press charges. Fortunately for the boys, Peter came up with a plan. It occurred to him that their shipwreck and story was something of value. And he called the TV station in Sydney and sold the rights to the story and paid Mr. Uhila £150 for his old boat and got the boys released on bail. A few days later, the TV station arrived. The mood when the boys returned to their homes in Tonga was jubilant. Almost the entire island of Ha'afehav, population 900, had turned out to welcome them home. Peter was proclaimed a national hero. Soon he received a message from the king inviting the captain for an audience. "Thank you for rescuing my 6 subjects," the king said. "Now, is there anything I can do for you?" And the captain didn't have to think long. He said, "Yes, I would like to trap lobster in these waters and start a business here." The king consented, and Peter returned to Sydney, resigned from his father's company, and commissioned a new ship, which he brought back and employed all 6 boys who he had rescued. He hired them as crew for his new fishing boat. The story gets better with lifelong friendships which developed between Peter and the boys and between the boys themselves, and was sustained more than we will ever know. And if you remember this story, remember it as a rewrite of The Lord of the Flies. This isn't human degradation and violence in the face of challenge. This isn't a story of despair for the human soul. This is a story of cooperation and survival. Human beings working together, not out of fear of death or each other, but out of joy of being together. This is a tale of friendship and loyalty, one that illustrates how much stronger we are if we can lean on each other. When Bregman, the historian who found this story, went to hear it from the boys and the captain himself years later, at the end of the meeting, Captain Warner turned to a cabinet and rummaged around a bit and drew out a heavy stack of papers that he gave the young historian. They were his memoirs, he explained, written for his children and his grandchildren. As Bregman looked down at them, he saw on the first page was written the words, "Life has taught me a great deal, including the lesson that you should always look for what is good and positive in people." As Rebecca Solnit describes in her marvelous book, A Paradise Built in Hell, disaster often liberates solidarity. She writes, and I quote, "A more beautiful world shimmers just beneath the surface, bobbing up whenever the systems that hold it underwater loosen their grip." Friends, we can rewrite the stories of our lives, of our society, of our failures, of our traumas, of our families, of our frailty, the seeds of the future we want to see, with stories that are stronger than we are. This year in church, we dive deeply into the story of our lives, your life, our life, the country and the world's life, to see what we can find to sustain our spirits, to see what we can live for from here on out. I think of it like this. These last 6 months during the pandemic have given us a gift, a reset of sorts, a way to rethink and retell a bigger global story. It asks us what will guide us as individuals and as society as we walk toward the many paths ahead. What will hold us at each junction of our lives, fear or love, self-preservation or generosity, a fear of death and giving in to security, or a wide embrace of all that life is? Will we live in fear and build a society based on it to preserve our separate selves, using each crisis as a weapon against our enemies, or will we stand for something stronger, more resilient, more unified? These are not all or nothing questions, I know. They're not all fear or all love. They are questions that ask us to trust each next step on the paths before us as they become visible, and tell each other with encouragement stories of human strength and charity about how we can overcome our worst choices and envision a fine and balanced world. We can write and tell stories that guide us to see each other for who we are, struggling toward knowing one another through the veil of our own perceptions in order to heal a desperate world. These are the explorations of this theme year, friends. I hope you will join us over and over again as we explore the stories of our lives. Amen and amen.